Greetings, listeners. So this is a quick overview of Chapter 7, my text, Third Supercycle. And the title of this chapter is State Monopoly Despotisms, Neocolonial Expansionisms, International Modernisms. And the point of this chapter is this is an inflection point in the text. And this is where, after I've done the survey work of the first 6 chapters, which is looking at World War I, its consequences, its aftermath, and this logic of uprisings and international revanchisms that start to fight it out on this new and incipiently post-imperial terrain, but the empires are still important, and there's another big conflict that's about to happen, the Second World War. So this chapter is an attempt to take stock of some of the long-term issues and to frame the issue of the third supercycle and argue, in fact, there are 3 major changes that happen during this period. And the best way to think about them is to think of them as the changes in economics, the changes in politics, and the changes in culture. And I set these changes up as a sort of a dialogue between those three things, but their expressions in the previous period of world history, and that is what I call global steam, and that's the period 1860 to 1914. So this is the predecessor to the period of the World Wars. And the basic point is, in global steam, the main form of economics was despotic industrialism, headquartered by Britain. The main form of politics was colonial expansionism. So the number of empires expands, and they're new empires, and they want their place in the sun, and so maritime colonialism and imperialism and expansionism reach a fever pitch in the late 19th century and then eventually trigger World War I. And the main form of culture was industrial modernism. So this is the massive change in music. It's the chromaticism with Wagner. The novel, it's the rise of naturalism with Zola, new forms of abstraction and painting with Impressionism and the beginnings of Cubism. So all the art forms are going through a massive change, will begin to go through a massive change as well. Now, what happens in the third supercycle is each of these changes sort of takes on a life of its own. And I argue that, in fact, between 1914 and 1945, the main form of economics is a new set of state monopoly despotisms. And it's no longer run by Britain or centered in Britain. The most powerful state monopoly despotism is that of the United States, the first true peer challenger to British rule. The main form of politics shifts away from colonial expansionism and towards neocolonial expansionism. And the main form of culture shifts away from industrial modernism to what I call international modernism, which is a much more internationalized, technologized, and mediatized version of the late 19th century modernisms. So much of the chapter is focusing on these 3 concepts and just walks through them one by one. And I'll start with state monopoly despotism. State monopoly, this concept has 3 major categories, or 3 subcategories, just to the economics and the economic change. And to make this a little bit more palpable and concrete, I used hydrological metaphors to explain it. And so I talk about time dams, time locks, and time canals, in the sense that each empire or group of polities that I'm talking about sort of constrains or channels capital the same way that those physical entities channel water. So time dam, it's building up potential, and then it has to release it, maybe or maybe not. Time locks, not in the sense of a padlock, in the sense of a canal or a passageway. So the lock is that little section where you raise and lower the ship. So you enter the lock and you raise it to match another body of water. And so Panama Canal is the famous example. So time locks, which connect bodies of water, and then finally time canals, which are through bodies of land that connect land, places in land, much like a river or a lake would. So the most powerful of the state monopoly despotisms, and the premier example of the time dam is, of course, the United States economy. And the point I make in this chapter is that the U.S. economy during this time period is the site of some ferocious contestation. So on the one hand, you have the traditional plutocrats and elites, commercial elites, Henry Ford most famously. On the other, you have new movements of industrial unions, reform movements, and citizens demanding more democracy, greater say, a welfare state. And the clash between these two is what we call Roosevelt's New Deal administration. Roosevelt played this game of he pretended not to take sides, but he sort of tilted a little bit towards the reformers, and he allowed them to win victories. And over time, the reformers did win significant victories against the plutocrats during this time period. Now, this time dam was backed up by extraordinary American dominance of world industry during this time period. Just a couple statistics. The United States auto industry represented or generated 72% of the world's auto fleet in 1914. So literally 2/3 of the autos on the planet were in the United States. By 1930, the US share had risen to 89%. So it was 9 out of 10. It's extraordinary. So the auto boom really happens in the 1920s in the United States before it happens anywhere else on the planet. And it would actually be a story after 1945. It would happen elsewhere on the planet. So the United States has a huge head start on the rest of the planet to that extent. This enormous auto industry also it came with a whole slew of other forms of industrial production. And so the United States was just overwhelmingly dominant in all of the industries which fed into automobiles. So the oil industry, largely American, the nickel industry, largely American, the steel industry, mostly American, tin production, mostly American. This commercial dominance and industrial dominance was also accompanied by technological integration. And this was very different from the British model of industrialization and industry. So the total number of scientists on US payrolls rose from 2,800 in 1921 to 46,000 by 1946. And this had the result that the United States becomes the world's leading producer of radios, electric stoves, irons, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners. So the new consumer technologies of the home and of consumer culture, they're all invented in the United States and would spread elsewhere after 1945. So that's the time bank in the United States. Now, the time locks, in the sense of canals, these consist of the Belgian, British, Dutch, and French empires. So these are the other 4 of the most industrialized polities that are the most democratic, have the longest history of industrialization, some of the biggest empires. And the basic story here is that during this period, there's a noticeable replacement of colonial institutions by neocolonial ones. So colonial administrations start to become contested zones where there's actually a fight over empire, and new kinds of mass anti-colonial resistance movements and pro-democracy movements start to emerge. Inside of these polities, so within Belgium, there are critics of empire. Within France, within Britain, within the Netherlands, there are ferocious critics of empire. And within their colonies, there are voices and mass movements of various kinds. And they start to push back against the colonial empires and push for reform and push for reform. And they start to win victories. So politics becomes contested in ways that was never true in the 19th century. And across a range of levels. And what happens is that the colonial strategies of rule start to become neocolonial strategies of rule. Most apparent and obvious in British colonized South Asia, where the Congress Party takes advantage of this and starts to build electoral machinery and get elected to the local version of parliament, and demand change and do things. And Gandhi's campaigns are a good example of this. The last of these economic changes, which I call time canals, these refer to the state-backed accumulation strategies of the empires and republics of the semi-periphery and the largest polities of the periphery. And the issue here is that there are a wide variety of these, and they're everything from import substitution strategies, production subsidies, tariff walls, the use of state-owned corporations and banks, the use of state equity, all these forms of state intervention in the economy, which did not exist in the 19th century, which had the liberal model, hands-off model, but now the state is intervening to construct things. And they range from Mussolini's Italy and sort of the state industrial conglomerates to Japan, the Japanese version, which is the Zaibatsu, the predecessors of the Kairetsu, these big family-run, semi-oligarchic corporate groups, generally run by a business family of some kind, that would cooperate closely with imperial authorities and set up production plants and equipment and factories in the Japanese colonies, to the Soviet Stalinist version of this, where Muscovite state capitalism had a certain accumulation strategy, to the Brazilian version of this, where the rule of the coffee lords, the coffee barons, in the 10s and 20s, and that fell into crisis. And so the state stepped in and began to regulate the price of coffee and buy up the coffee and play an administrative role. So there's a wide variety, and there isn't one model there, but there's a range of outcomes and strategies. Okay, that's the economic side of the story. So the second big change in the political sphere during the third supercycle is this transition from colonial expansionism to neocolonial expansionism. And the way I've framed this is that it's very useful to think of the period 1914-1945 as actually a direction. We can give it a direction with the advantage of hindsight and argue that there is a kind of not a quite linear, but there is a kind of a semi-linear larger direction in that time period. And the time can be divided up into 5 stages. The slow dissolution of colonialism and its replacement with neocolonialism. So the very first stage, obviously, World War I. So the War of the Empires, or more precisely, the War of the Empires over colonies. Okay? And that triggers the second stage, which is the 1916-1922 cycle of the anti-colonial and anti-imperial uprisings. The third stage, the post-1922 regimes of international revanchism, which try to shore up these imperial structures. The fourth, which I have not mentioned until now, the 1935-1942 wars of the three Axis conquest adventurisms and Soviet neocolonial expansionism, all 4 are involved, to replace Britain as world hegemon. And then fifth and finally, the 1942-1945 Allied counteroffensive, which destroyed the Axis empires, inaugurated the era of U.S. hegemony, and ushered in the formal epoch of world decolonization. During this chapter, I also focus on 3 of the most important thinkers who have thought through these aspects of these 5 stages. And just to mention them very briefly, W.E.B. Du Bois, concept of proletarian emancipation. So the idea that the working masses of the colonial world can rise up and take down these empires if they organize against empire. Antonio Gramsci's notion of hegemony. So that's an anti-fascist strategy of trying to understand how Mussolini was ruling Italy and to come up with ways to defeat fascism. And Walter Benjamin's concept of history writing, which is a pushback of this notion of history as linear progress. And Benjamin's point is that history is not linear progress. There are also catastrophes where regression and revanchism take place. So we have to focus on both progress and regress. What these 3 thinkers focus on is what I call in the text the very nascent, very nebulous, very inchoate, it's just beginning to exist, project of the democracy of the 2 billion. Okay, 2 billion people on Earth in the 1920s, a little over 2 billion, and they're starting to struggle for democracy. And of course, it's a very difficult struggle. And one of the big contradictions that all those 3 thinkers have to wrestle with is the incomplete marketization of the world. So only 350 to 400 million of those 2 billion people at that time were fully or partly waged workers. So most people on the planet were subsistence farmers, craft workers, and lived in feudal societies, and were necessarily connected to their political, didn't think of themselves as political citizens, and consequently were very difficult to mobilize in anything other than a very local struggle. So the whole notion of modern citizenship, modern nation states, national elections, that's normal in the 21st century. That was very new during this time period. So they're trying to think through these contradictions and come up with strategies to mobilize that 400 million and to get the other 1.6 billion involved. Third part of the chapter focuses on aesthetics and the culture of what I call, this is my own invention, international modernisms. Now I should note I use this term very differently from Frederick Jameson's periodization. So his general take is that he classifies modernism as the aesthetic works between roughly 1850 and 1950. I disagree with that. In my version, I regard those as actually slightly different periods. I refer to the industrial realisms of 1815, 1860, not 1850, 1860, the industrial modernisms of 1860, 1914, and then finally the international modernisms of 1914, 1945. So basically, the last period basically witnesses the triumph of the modern culture industry as we've come to know it. And therefore, this is the first period of history where we can kind of look back and kind of see ourselves in a serious way, because there is mass broadcasting, there's radio broadcasting, there's mass cinema, there's paperback novels, there's consumer culture everything, there's automobiles, etc., there's commercial fashion. So a lot of the characteristic features of our world today, of the transnational consumerism, they're there. They're already there. The embryonic forms are there. One of the great texts on this that I explore is Michael Denning's Noise Uprising, which has a wonderful account of what he calls vernacular musics. So these are musical styles which had one foot in the port cities of the global semi-periphery and periphery. So these are cities like Jakarta and Dutch-ruled Indonesia, Cairo and British neo-colonized Egypt, Buenos Aires and independent but still neo-colonized Argentina. These are musical styles that have one foot there and one foot in an international market of musical recording. And these recordings were controlled by 5 very large music corporations. So the predecessor of today's culture industries and social media giants and Facebook, Google, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, and I'll just read a section from Denning's text, which is very evocative and goes to the heart of this contradiction, why this bridge between giant record companies and audiences was so productive. So Denning, quote, "Because vernacular musics were not, for the most part, the musics of rural peasants and sharecroppers. They were not the folk musics that were coming to be collected and studied by folklorists, nor were they the musics of the industrial working classes that emerged in the capitalisms of the North Atlantic over the previous century. They were neither the work songs of weavers and miners, nor the parlor songs and minstrel tunes of London music halls and New York vaudeville houses. Rather, the new vernacular musics of the era of electrical recording emerged on the edges and borders of the empires of global capitalism. In the barrios, Spanish for neighborhood or outskirts, the bidonvilles, French for suburbs, barrack yards, arrabales, Spanish for outskirts, and favelas, Portuguese for suburbs, of an archipelago of colonial ports, linked by steamship routes, railway lines, and telegraph cables, moving commodities and people across and between empires." Unquote. A wonderful passage, and it gets to this materiality of empire and these traffic and this trade and how each of these spaces ends up creating vernacular music, so popular music styles, and then artists come along and they create wonderful new forms, and then these forms, they're documented to us because the record companies want to sell this stuff, it's popular, and so there's a whole group of people whose job is literally to hunt down the latest musical sensation in Buenos Aires or in Cairo or Jakarta, wherever it is, Johannesburg, all across the planet, places in South Asia and Mumbai, Bombay back then, trying to find the latest talent and get that talent and then to sell records. So the beginnings of the modern culture industry, to be quite honest. Now, very unequal, very hierarchical, very controlled by a small group of imperial metropoles, but still the recognized blueprint for everything that's happening today, where all these networks are now in overdrive and in hyperdrive. We have the internet as this space where all these things are happening now. The last part of the chapter, I take this notion of vernacular music and I broaden it slightly and I apply it to some other forms of music. I rewrite it and retrofit it slightly. And so I do some close readings, actually, of some of the great musical works of this period. Robert Johnson's blues music, Duke Ellington's jazz music, and Alban Berg's unfinished, still great opera, Lulu. It wasn't completed, but there are sections that were complete and which are a wonderful archive and achieved some amazing things. So I give a close reading of each of these artists and what they achieved, how they achieved, and how this recording history and this transformation, this rise of electric recording, which was very new in the 1920s, changes the way that musicians are thinking about works of art and doing various things. And also changes audiences. Audiences change and are now expecting a more diverse musical spectrum. You can now begin to assemble an archive of music. This was never possible before. So the internationalization of the audience, the internationalization of the artist, the internationalization of musical production, consumption, critique, all these processes take off during this time period and will have very profound effects, of course, later on and after 1945, but they already have very, very significant effects in this time period. And so this period is very important to understand because we see the template for everything that's going to come in the future.